Good afternoon, everybody. I am Guillaume van der Loo, I'm a researcher at CEPS and at the Center Leuven of Global Governance Studies in Belgium. And it's my pleasure to kick off this new session on economic integration in the context of the Eastern Partnership. Perfect panel, I think, to digest our lunch. It is my pleasure, and because we actually have a stellar panel to tackle this topic. But first, if you allow me, I would like to make some introductory remarks very briefly. Just to flag that actually almost 15 years ago, when the neighborhood policy was conceptualized, the ideas in the area of trade were actually quite very ambitious. I mean, the first Commission communications were saying that the EU should offer these countries a stake in the EU internal market. And this was all quite vague, but this developed over time. And on the one hand, now bilaterally, with some countries, we have these very ambitious association agreements and DCFTAs. And with other countries, it's a bit more complicated in the context of the Eurasian Economic Union. But also, I mean, at the multilateral level, the EU initially had the idea to develop a kind of a neighborhood economic community. This was rather vague, and actually it still is. So then when the Eastern Partnership was developed, the Eastern Partnership actually did not add substantially new issues with regard to the trade dimension of the ENP. Now, where are we 15 years later? I mean, we all know that, of course, the EU has now concluded finally, or in any case, they are completely in place now, the association agreements and DCFTAs with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. These are quite ambitious, unique trade agreements. I mean, they liberalize almost all trade in goods and services. But they also have this very specific component that they oblige, or in any case, EU and Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia committed themselves to take over a huge chunk of EU legislation. And the idea is that they gradually integrate to a certain extent in the internal market. But of course, this creates quite challenges with regard to implementation. You can also wonder if this EU legislation is always the right medicine for the problems in these countries. So that relates to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And then I think this was already discussed this morning with the specific Armenian case that just before signature, Armenia decided not to sign the association agreement. But now we have the new agreement with Armenia in place. And actually, I think the EU and Armenia went as far as possible to conclude an agreement while still being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, if you look at the structure, I mean, also during the negotiations, I heard that they actually started from the rejected association agreement. And if you look at the structure, it's actually quite similar. Provisions on institutional cooperation, foreign and security policy, justice, freedom, and security. I mean, sometimes a bit less ambitious compared to the Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgian one. But of course, the big difference is in trade. Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Customs Union, so there is no preferential trade in goods. But on the other hand, Armenia benefits from the GSP Plus from the European Union. So this cushions a bit this problem. And nevertheless, if you look to certain provisions in the Armenian agreement, actually in the area of services, it's quite ambitious. And this is also quite significant. There are nevertheless still a lot of legislative approximation commitments in the Armenia agreement. Armenia will approximate, according to the agreement, its legislation in the area of consumer protection, climate, and so on and so forth. But of course, without having preferential access to the internal market, which is of course a different situation in the case of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So, and then of course we have the negotiations which are currently taking place with Azerbaijan. And Professor Schumacher asked me to explain a bit, or try to explain what they are negotiating. And actually, I don't know. I mean, because of course Azerbaijan is also it's not a member of the WTO, so there will be no preferential access. And of course, it's also hard to imagine that Azerbaijan will approximate to EU consumer protection legislation. So, I mean, most likely it will go in the direction of sectoral cooperation, but things that really don't really bite. Energy is, of course, a very sensitive issue. So maybe they can confirm some WTO principles, but I have no idea. And maybe there are people here in this room that can help us with this. And then we have Kazakhstan and Belarus. Kazakhstan already has this enhanced PCA. Also for the agreement with Azerbaijan, one of the key challenges is to find a name for this agreement, because we already have partnership and cooperation agreements, enhanced partnership and cooperation agreements, and so on and so forth. So for Kazakhstan, the enhanced PCA is less ambitious than the one with Armenia, because there are no specific commitments in relation to legislative approximation. It's actually just an ambitious cooperation agreement with not a lot of trade integration. And then we have Belarus, of course, also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So and also not a member of the WTO. Now, sometimes it's being said that the EU cannot move forward with Belarus as long as they are not a member of the WTO. But this is not actually true, because of course the EU is negotiating now an agreement with Azerbaijan, and also Azerbaijan is not a member of the WTO. So, but in any case, for example, Belarus is now quite serious in its accession to the WTO. It wants to join the WTO before the next ministerial conference, or in any case that's the ambition, after 25 years of negotiations almost. So maybe this can create a new dynamic also for EU-Belarus cooperation and economic integration. Now, as already mentioned, we have a stellar panel to guide us through all these topical issues. I'm very happy to present first Professor Kataryna Wolczuk from the University of Birmingham. Kataryna has worked already for a while intensively on Eastern Partnership, EU relations with post-Soviet countries, and so on and so forth. We also have Dr. Georgian names, always so beautiful but difficult to pronounce, Natia Daghelishvili of the Georgian Institute of Politics. And Natia also worked already quite intensively on the Georgian DCFTA. We have Kamil from the Center for European Studies of Warsaw, who Eastern Studies of Warsaw. And Kamil quite intensively also worked on EU-Moldova relations. We're also very pleased that we have the ambassador, Hugues Mingarelli, from the EU delegation in Kyiv with us, and Mr. Wisam Kassem, participant of the Eastern Partnership New Generation Summit. So I think the speakers know the drill. The idea is that we have a short and snappy introduction of 5-ish minutes, and that we then first engage amongst ourselves, and then of course that we engage with all of you. So without further ado, Kataryna, the floor is yours to kick off.
Can I steal your microphone? Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can either had, sorry, can you hear me? Either you had too much lunch or not enough. You can fall asleep or you can stay alert. And I'm afraid I'm going to tell two stories, one simple and one very complex. But I have to disappoint those who want numbers. I will only have a couple of them, so you can fall asleep now. But I will just mention something, take a step back, because when we talk about the association agreements, we talk ultimately about the free trade agreement. The association agreement is like a sort of book with a secret garden. The secret garden. You read the association agreement, you get to chapter title 4 or 5, depending which country, and then a massive garden opens of the DCFTA. And this is sort of very interesting for lawyers' agreement, and yet incredibly complex to implement. And I would like to stress those 3 or 4 unprecedented features of the association agreements with the DCFTAs. First of all is the asymmetric nature of those agreements. The partner countries have agreed to take on sort of incredible commitments, asymmetric commitments vis-à-vis the EU, even without sort of the prospect of the membership perspective to accompany it. They're also incredibly complex, one amongst the complex agreements in the world. But also, what needs to be emphasized, if we look at the fact that there are free trade agreements, the most substantive part, they are also, the EU has provided unprecedented level of support. If you look around the world, this is use of the free trade agreement to modernize the countries while at the same time integrating them with the EU. So it's a very sort of ambitious in scope, and the role of the EU, not only, it's not like NAFTA that you just have created the common rules, but it's actually this specific new innovative use of the free trade agreement. But there is also a paradox. The countries have taken asymmetric commitments in order to modernize, which means they want to improve, to reform, and because they don't have the capacity to implement it as it is. So what we have is a dual-track policy. On the one hand, it's implementation of the association agreement. On the other hand, we are engaging in profound state building or rebuilding in the associated countries. And the scale of state weakness has only been realized while we are implementing the agreement. So the clock is ticking in terms of specific deadlines and specific sort of parts of the association agreement, and yet the capacity to implement the agreement is actually being built. So I think there's this most interesting is this dual track policy of sort of implementation of the association agreement. And the DCFTA part is very useful to actually see how it works in practice. And I'll very briefly elaborate on this. The DCFTA is the most dense sort of pact with specific sort of deadlines part of the agreement. And when we look at trade, basically, the trade liberalization has been a big success story, especially for Moldova and Georgia. And here comes the one figure. For Ukraine, 43% of its basically its trade is with the EU. It's an all-time sort of historic maximum. But what we also know that the effect of the initial trade liberalization starting sort of fading sort of away, because now we are dealing with more regulatory issues, domestic, non-tariff barriers to trade. And this is where the story becomes really interesting, because we get to the story of state capacity. And it's very interesting because the DCFTA actually tests those countries when it comes to policy making. And we know from the post-Soviet states, they have actually not reformed the executive branch governmental capacities, with the partial exception of Georgia. But Georgia did it under President Saakashvili by actually destroying the institutions, abolishing them, and actually not reforming them as necessarily as such. So what we have, the DCFTA is interesting because it's usually looked after by the ministries of the economy. They tend to be big, powerful, and they tend to operate like silos. And then there are lots of issues which require for the DCFTA horizontal coordination, customer sort of consumer protection, intellectual property rights, customs, etc. And we can see that the governments are learning and developing the capacity to work in such a way. And yet, there is ongoing monitoring, there are deadlines, and there is accounting or reporting insofar as the implementation is concerned. And there is this synchronization as well. I'll just mention the example of Moldova, when the DCFTA, as part of the public administration reform, which was very much needed, the staff in the ministry looking after the DCFTA was reduced from 7 to 2. So the capacity was lost for good reasons, yet the clock is ticking. So this is sort of the challenges that we face in terms of state rebuilding versus implementing the DCFTA. But there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the most important part of the DCFTA specifically is actually reforming domestic institutions and capacity building as such. And this is actually happening under the banner. There is plenty of action, there is a lot of movement, but it perhaps doesn't adapt to such a clear sort of outcome as we would have expected. On the other hand, perhaps the expectations insofar as the deadlines in the association agreements were perhaps not quite realistic and did not factor in that necessity for state building. And I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And you mentioned so many issues that we need to pick up on during the discussion. Now I would like to give the floor to Natia, because of course, I mean, Georgia was a bit of a special case, no, in relation to these DCFTAs, because under Saakashvili, I mean, everything was about deregulation, no? And for example, to tackle corruption, deregulating everything, whereas these DCFTAs actually are, again, regulation. So it was interesting, or in any case, I'm also very curious to see how Georgia's coping with that.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I also want to express my gratitude toward the organizers of the conference. Thank you for being here. I want you to share Georgian experience, how Georgia is implementing DCFTA agreement. According to the annual action plans, Georgia has quite big success in implementation of all the commitments according to annual action plans, according to the roadmap, etc. But in reality, I want to assess how it is reflected to export, to figures, and how broader society and companies, not only big companies, but small and medium-sized enterprises can benefit from DCFTA. To begin with the Eastern Partnership Initiative, Georgia now holds two main deliverables. First is association agreement, second is visa-free regime, and DCFTA, which entered into force at 2014, was a very good starting point in Europeization and in enhancement of Eastern Partnership politics. Everybody was looking at DCFTA, and first impact assessments, what were done, actually were too ambitious. According to the 2012, there was impact assessment based by Polish think tanks, Case and Ecoris, and according to the study, Georgia's export was supposed to grow 9% in short-term perspective and 12% in long-term perspective. But in reality, we have half of those figures. What happened? Can we say that Georgian cannot benefit from DCFTA, or in reality, as you mentioned, non-tariff barriers and such commitments are too difficult to be overcome by Georgian companies? I want to first of all put emphasis on Georgia's export structure itself, because it is very specific and it is very concentrated. When we look at the export, top 10 exporters share is too high and is up to 85%, which means that most of export potential sectors are either monopolized or oligopolized. So Georgia still remains to be an exporter of such raw materials as, for example, ferroalloys, copper and ore, fertilizer, chemicals, etc., which is too concentrated, and small and medium-sized enterprises cannot really compete. So we have very good success stories in which even 200% growth we have. For example, non-timber forest products export, for example, organic products export, dried fruit exports, etc., etc. But the share is so small that it is not reflected to the export figures. So the main challenges comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, not the bigger companies who are main exporters, and the real impact is a very long-term perspective to have impact on our export. This is first main point I wanted to stress. And the second point is why small and medium-sized enterprises have so many obstacles in DCFTA implementation. Here we have very general reason and several different interconnected reasons. First of all, small and medium-sized enterprises cannot ensure continuous supply to the EU single market, which is quite big challenge, and this is coming from several reasons. First of all, there is very big problem connected to the access to finance for especially small and medium-sized enterprises, and according to amendments of credit system in Georgia, it's even more problematic for now. The second main issue connected to the general level of awareness, what benefits can EU market provide to the SMEs, especially in rural regions. This is quite polarized situation. In Tbilisi, level of awareness is quite better than in rural areas, and also problems are connected to the meeting to EU standards, which is connected to lack of international certification systems and other non-tariff barriers, which means to produce European quality production, which would be competitive to the EU market. And those different factors cause high unit cost for for production, and it's very difficult and costly to small and medium-sized enterprises, considering lack of infrastructure, lack of logistical hubs, and hence high transportation costs to cover all the transaction costs to penetrate to the EU market and to overcome those non-tariff barriers. The EU quite supports much. In this case, 20 deliverables of Eastern Partnership means several programs, which is connected to cooperation and cluster development, and future model of some sectors development is supposed to be bigger scale and economy of scale. So we cannot say that Georgia cannot fully benefit from DCFTA because it's only for years and half when it is being implemented, and in order to see significant impact and to see real results of DCFTA implementation, it needs much more time. So I would stop here and would be very glad to respond if somebody interested in more details, and we can expand more figures how it is. But the main picture looks like that some non-tariff barriers still are very problematic to especially small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's why in figures, considering that EU is one of the biggest partner in terms of export, are not reflected to the export structure yet. Thank you, and I would be glad to involve later in discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And Natia, also for this more microeconomic perspective almost with regard to the challenge of the DCFTA implementation for SMEs, standards, but something that I want to follow up on during discussion is maybe what the macro perspective is, more the strategic perspective in the sense that Georgia is quite active on the FTA markets with China, with Turkey, and there are challenges from a micro perspective, but to what extent is Georgia really using the DCFTA more strategically to align with global value chains? For example, this FTA with China, which almost fits into the One Belt, One Road. I mean, Georgia is quite active in that, especially compared to the other countries. So I would like to follow up with that on that later on. But then we now go to Kamil for the perspective on the challenges for Moldova for its DCFTA implementation. I also spotted in UCV that you're following quite closely what's happening in Transnistria. And I was also curious if you can shed some light on the application of the DCFTA in Transnistria, because that's something in any case special and a bit controversial. So, but in any case, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I will manage to get to Transnistria in this part, but then we can follow with questions, of course, on this as well. First of all, thank you very much for having me here, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm even more happy because I actually live nearby, like 100 meters from here. So it wasn't only 5-minute walks, but what's more important, I'm happy to be on this side of the fence because I'm usually very envy looking at all those students here in this beautiful territory. I would also like to follow up what Kataryna said about the state capacity to implement the CFTA. This is really crucial thing, and when it comes to Moldova, it was causing a problem. But when it comes to Transnistria, it was even a bigger problem. There were negotiations about the implementation or the way how to implement DCFTA in Transnistria running for quite some time. And it was a serious problem to find a competent man or a woman, of course, on the Transnistrian side who would be both speaking English and understand economy on the level which will be high enough to actually negotiate those issues. So that's just for a start. But ladies and gentlemen, I would like to somehow echo to what Julian Groza already said and argue that despite all shortcomings, in case of Moldova, DCFTA became probably the most successful part of association agreement. And in this presentation, I would like to focus mostly on the practical effects of DCFTA implementation, so a little bit more numbers again. And in order to do so, I would like to bring just 3 figures, just for a start. And one of those figures were already mentioned by Julian, and this is the 360 million euro. And this is the estimated estimated by our colleagues from Moldova, net effect of DCFTA on the total export from Moldova for the period between 2015 and 2017. And 2015 is the first complete year of DCFTA being in place, because the provisional implementation of DCFTA in Moldova started in September 2014. 360 million euros. So this means that without DCFTA being in place, Moldovan export could have been smaller by such amount of money. And from the Moldovan perspective and the perspective of Moldovan trade, this is a huge number, and you will see this a little bit further. Second figure is 63%, and export to EU from Moldova increased by, between 2013, which is the last year without DCFTA, last complete year, and 2018 by 63%, or 725 million euro. And this is a vast number, especially for Moldova. And if we will compare it with the previous figure, you will see that DCFTA is responsible for at least 50% of this growth. So half of this growth can be attributed to DCFTA. And what's even more important is that in quantitative, not qualitative terms, rise of export to the EU was even more spectacular, and this is due to the fact that between 2014 and 2016 the Moldovan lei depreciated greatly. So this is another issue. And the third figure is 69%, and this figure already were somewhere here before, and this is the current share for the year 2018 of the EU countries in Moldova's export. And before the CFTA in 2013, this indicator was much lower, as it amounted only to about 47% to be exact. And what is worth mentioning is that in the same period of time, share of Commonwealth of Independent States, and particularly Russia, in export from Moldova decreased dramatically from 38% in 2013 to just about 15% in 2018. So after the beginning of the CFTA implementation, Romania became the main export partner of Moldova, and right now it's responsible for about a quarter of Moldovan export. It replaced Russia on the first position. Now, what is really important, and not only from the economical but also from the political point of view, is that the CFTA not only allowed Moldova to redirect most of its trade from the unstable, politically dependent Russian market to the EU market, but also helped Moldova to compensate losses in the post-Soviet markets caused by Russian embargo imposed in 2013 and 2014, by the depreciation of Russian ruble, and caused by the sanctions imposed by Russia and the war in the eastern Ukraine, and the war in the eastern Ukraine as such. So basically, if between 2013 and 2018 export to Commonwealth of Independent States decreased by 500 million euro, with the EU it increased by 700 million, which is a 200 million euro surplus. So you can clearly see the difference. And in 2018, Moldova managed to restore or even exceed pre-sanction level of export of basically all agricultural and food products which were hit previously by the Russian sanctions. This includes vegetables, meat, dairy. The only exception, the serious exception here, is alcohol and Moldovan wines, but export of wines is still growing quite rapidly, and we can expect that this year, maybe next year, the latest, Moldova would reach the pre-sanction level of alcohol export. And one may say that we should paradoxically thank Russia here, because without sanctions, reorientation of Moldovan trade probably would take quite a lot longer. Moldovan producers and exporters would not have such intense incentives, would not be under such pressure to look for new markets, to improve quality of their goods. In general, what is also interesting, and you will not see this in the declaration from the Moldovan politicians, especially those who are pro-Russian, agri-food sector was the biggest beneficiary of the DCFTA in Moldova. And this happened despite the fears that Moldova farmers would not be able to compete with EU producers, or that the Moldovan market would be flooded by the import from the EU countries. Both those claims proven to be untrue, and actually between 2014 and 2017, import of agri-food products to Moldova from EU decreased, not increased, decreased by 4%. And here I would like to stop. Please don't get me wrong, DCFTA is not only in the flying colors, it's not only, it's not flawless, but this is kind of a success story for Moldova, in this part at least. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Kamil. Nevertheless, I want to challenge you a bit also on the real problems and challenges with regard to the implementation later on. But you also mentioned that the Moldova DCFTA compensated for the loss on the Russian market for Moldova. And I think the ambassador would like, or most likely would make the same argument for the case of Ukraine. I think there was even a specific notice of the EU delegation a couple of years ago really flagging this, that the EU market went open, that it's compensated for the loss on the Russian market. So please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Very happy to be with you. Thank you, Tobias, for inviting me. First of all, Guillaume, a bit of history, because you started your introduction by saying that we started to reflect about the possibility to have a DCFTA with some of our partner countries when we launched the European Neighbourhood policy. Not exactly like that. Huh? When we wrote the first paper on a possible specific relationship between the EU and some Eastern partners, it was in 2003, and at that time we did not think of European neighbourhood policy. Our concept was wider Europe. And our idea was to have some kind of specific relationship between the country which would belong the following year in 2004 to the EU, the countries of Central Europe, and the countries belonging to the collective security treaty of Tashkent. And at that time, we were two Commission bureaucrats with a pen trying to invent something about that. And we said, but what can the EU offer to the countries of Eastern Europe in the security area? I should not say that, but not a lot. The EU could afford at that time. Things have changed a bit, but not that much. We cannot say that today the EU is a major strategic player. Also, some progress have been made over the last years in the field of defense and security. In the political field, we cannot offer any EU membership perspective even for the next 20 years. So what can we offer? And the EU was, and to a large extent still is, the main trade bloc in the world, thanks to our single market. And therefore, we said we should reflect on how we can, one way or another, integrate economically these countries in the EU economy. And this was the beginning of the reflection. But in the first papers on the wider Europe and then the ENP, we did not mention DCFTA. The DCFTA concept came when in 2007, the same Commission bureaucrat said, we have regular meeting with all our Eastern partners to discuss the implementation of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, but this PCA, which was negotiated between 1992 and 1994, is totally outdated. In the trade area, for instance, it was negotiated when these countries were not WTO members. In 2007, most of them were WTO members, and therefore we said we should negotiate new agreements to replace the PCA. And there, again, we said, but what do we put in this new agreement? And same conclusion, the most serious thing that the EU can offer to the neighbors is to be part of the EU single market. And here we came up with the DCFTA for only Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, unfortunately, which is basically about, as you all know, about regular approximation and market access. Alors, in these two areas, we are, it's true, Kataryna, very ambitious if we look at the administrative capacity of our partner countries. But at the same time, generally, we are not ambitious enough in the EU. So for once, we said, let's reflect on how we can really get the economy of these three countries in the EU single market, which is a main trade bloc. And this is extremely important, and why we say it is important, not for theoretical reason, but when we had the enlargement of 2004 with the country of Central Europe, what we saw in the EU Commission is that as soon as countries like Poland, like Slovakia, at the time it was Czechoslovakia, Hungary, had taken over our norms and standards in the economic field, even without being members of the EU, there was a flow of direct investment going to these countries. And therefore, we still believe, rightly or wrongly, that if tomorrow Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine manage to take over these thousands of laws, norms, and regulations, l'acquis communautaire, for them, it's today the most important thing that the EU can offer, because they will be part of the most important trade bloc in the world, and their companies, big or SMEs, will be able to trade and invest in both directions without facing any obstacle. Because as we know today, the main obstacles to trade between these countries and the EU are not custom duties. For any WTO member, this is no longer the main problem. It's non-tariff barriers to trade. And for that, we have to fight for years to harmonize the legislation of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine with the EU one. Here, Kataryna, you are not wrong when you say, and what about the administrative capacity of this country? It's true, especially for Moldova, maybe, that they have a limited administrative capacity. But the first obstacle is very often the lack of political will, because harmonizing their legislation with the UN means to put into question the vested interest of the oligarchs who are running these three countries. Voilà. Because the legislation, the norms and standards which have been put in place between 1992 and a few years ago in these three countries were designed to serve the interest of a few powerful people, the so-called oligarchs. And today, these people, under different modalities, try to derail the harmonization of legislation in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. I say under different modalities because the three countries are different, without any doubt. But there is this story of political will. Do we have the government? We are ready to fight on a daily basis to harmonize the legislation. And then obviously there is a question of the administrative capacity. We have to assist with the reform of the public administration to make the state apparatus more efficient. We have to promote decentralization, to shift responsibility towards the local communities, because this is important as well if you want to improve the quality of the public services rendered to the people. Alors, for Ukraine, because you have already mentioned Georgia and Moldova, no miracle, but we started to implement the DCFTA on a provisional basis in January 2016 and officially since September 2017, but de facto since January 2016. And Kataryna said that today 43% of Ukraine exports go to the EU market today. 4 years ago, it was 25%. 25%, 42%. It's not bad. Alors, it's true that this is partly due to the fact that the Ukrainian, like a few others, have lost their Russian market. But still, there is little doubt that the DCFTA, despite the difficulty to implement it, has already have a positive impact on economic growth and export flows in Ukraine. Do they do everything they should do? The political will is there. They have been able in Ukraine at government level to adopt an action plan for the implementation of the DCFTA, which set clear priorities. we told them, but you have to get the Verovna Rada, the parliament, on board. Okay, they drew up a joint roadmap between the Kabmin, as they say, the government, and the Verovna Rada, and they have a common document with the priorities, and they update these papers on a regular basis. So the political will at the top level is there. But when a draft bill arrives at the Verovna Rada, there you have a number of members of the parliament who are in the hands of oligarchs and try to stop it or to derail it. And we have to fight on a daily basis to push the harmonization of legislation. It's a very long process, without any doubt. Another element which is important is to explain to the population, to the people, what these terrible jargons, DCFTA, blah, blah, regulatory convergence mean. We have to convince the average citizen that implementing the DCFTA will ultimately have an impact on the living conditions of the more vulnerable segment of the population. How to do that? I'm not a communication guy, but we have to improve our communication to ensure that this does not remain a subject for discussion between bureaucrats or politicians, but that the sense of these agreements are understood by the citizens of the three countries, and that they can understand that to improve their living condition and to open new perspective for their children, it is important for them to get in the EU single market. Well, I have already spoken more than 5 minutes, and I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And you also mentioned a bit the challenge how to make the DCFTA sexy in Ukraine, and how, in any case, to communicate this. And that's a bit also the challenge, I think, in the Eastern Partnership, because, of course, the Commission or the EU will say, Ukraine, please, first now focus on the implementation without thinking about the next ambitious steps. And, of course, in the Eastern Partnership, some new ideas are being developed, but these are actually quite technical, sectoral, sometimes useful and very realistic options, but this actually does not add to the attractiveness for a larger public. So maybe this is some of the challenges that we can discuss later on. But now I'm very happy to give the floor to Wisam Kassem, who was a participant of the Eastern Partnership New Generation Summit, and specifically on the panel on economic cooperation. So please tell us what you have been cooking up yesterday.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude for this intellectually enriching opportunity. I hope this discussion will be very fruitful indeed. There are two things I would like to discuss today. First of all, I would like to go through the recommendations that we have done yesterday, me and my colleagues from the economic panel of the Young Generation Summit. And second of all, I would like to discuss about Armenia. We have not really been mentioning Armenia here in this debate. And especially this is very interesting and very relevant indeed, because in 2017 they signed the CEPA agreement, which has been provisionally applied in June. The thing that I would like to go through and to somehow also invite our audience and to a large extent the panelists is to what extent is it compatible with the Eurasian Economic Union? This is something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be taken into account. But first thing first. First, I would like to present the recommendation that we have made. When we made our recommendation, we emphasized a lot on the crackdown of corruption. Many reports that we read from the European Union when it comes to supporting of SMEs is that there are somehow lack of financing, and when there is financing, this money sometimes does not even arrive. And corruption is largely and partially responsible for this trend, unfortunately. So we have developed a recommendation that goes as followed. The disadvantages of the small and medium-sized enterprises are exposed to aggregated by persistence of state capture and vested interest in the Eastern Neighbourhood. In light of these 5 deliverables of 2020 for a stronger economy, we would like to add an additional phase to our recommendation. This is the crackdown on corruption part. First, before any of these 5 deliverables that were mentioned in the 2020 can be achieved, it is with highest necessity that we emphasize on the crackdown on corruption in these 6 EAP countries, given that it would be extremely challenging for these 5 deliverables to be achieved with a high level of corruption in these respective 6 EAP countries. Only after a significant progress on the crackdown on corruption has been achieved and reached, the EU could then allow for the investment, for the funding, and for digital harmonization to take place. And we normally here emphasize on the training of the SMEs in order to make them more comprehensive, make them more competitive, make them more resistant in case the country of the respective EAP countries would then liberalize their economies. We have an example, a practical example in Armenia in the Tavush-Mars region, which a EU4 initiative has been initiated in order to support regional rural areas in Armenia, especially in when it comes to agriculture, roads building, which eventually would lead to greater mobility. But these initiatives, the training and the funding, targeted funding of the European Union has led to 120 direct jobs increasing and 400 indirect jobs. It has made a significant change to many people living outside in rural areas, and I believe this is a very, very comprehensive and very precise approach to this initiative. This measure will also lead to improvement of business, environment, innovation, and growth potential, and capacity building. We have mentioned a lot of capacity building for small and medium-sized enterprises. The last phase, after the European has made a conditionality on crackdown on corruption, afterwards allowing investment and funding of SMEs, that's when countries can begin liberalizing. Liberalizing economies would eventually lead to increase of foreign investment, which then would help in facilitation of trade. And with the right resilience, with the right approach, it will eventually also lead to the survival of these SMEs and the potential growth of these SMEs. They will not crack under the corruption, at least, and diversification of economy is also greatly important. That would increase the possibilities of different market shares, so you don't have countries like Moldova or a country like Georgia competing for agriculture, one of them potentially losing. So with that being said, this is the 3 comprehensive approach we have made. Of course, this is due to time constraint, I've only given the general approach of it. The final product will be much more comprehensive. So secondly, I would like to discuss about CEPA. To what extent CEPA could be compatible with the the Eurasian Economic Union. As many here know, we have many Armenians in our audience. Armenia signed the Eurasian Economic Agreement with Russia in 2013 and were therefore not allowed to sign the DCFTAs and the Association Agreement. Of course, there has been many geopolitical constraints involved up until this very moment. In 2017, the European Union signed the Comprehensive Enhanced and Partnership Agreement, and afterwards it was provisionally applied in June. The interesting thing about this approach, it's quite unique in a sense that it is cross-sectoral. It is not exactly an economic agreement, but is an agreement that would eventually lead to improvement of investment climate, stimulating growth and jobs, and will create a better regulatory environment for businesses to grow. But before this can be achieved, you can call it Europeanization of domestic laws within Armenia. By, let's say, Europeanization, if you will, of domestic laws, it would eventually lead to what I would like to call a positive cross-sectoral spillover, that the Europeanization and the increasing of standards would eventually spill over to another sector, which would then eventually spill over to the economic sector. With that being said, there are, of course, it sounds very fine, but there are, of course, some constraints and some. There are, of course, some constraint that I would like to mention is that to what extent this is actually compatible when we talk about the judicial aspect of this agreement. This does, to some extent, when looking at it from a Euro-Asian perspective, let's say that in a scenario where some of these Eurasian economic countries does not live up to the standards that were stipulated in the CEPA agreement, what would happen then? Which law would be supreme over the other? In case, let's say, that the Eurasian economic standards would prevail over the CEPA ones, that would be contradictory. That would actually undermine what CEPA stands for, normativity and the European standards of goods and services. Due to time constraint, I would like to stop now, but I would love to continue this debate if there are questions for it. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks. And it was almost a cliffhanger because you were flagging something very important, the compatibility, and there will be time to come back on that specific point again. Because indeed, I mean, and this applies for Belarus as well, the compatibility, I mean, they cannot conclude a preferential agreement in goods, that's a no-brainer. But then there are so many areas in these agreements, so it's quite vague. TBT, SPS, public procurement, and there the Eurasian Economic Union is quite vague, because of course opponents of the Eurasian Economic Union are saying, and these are not difficult to find, it's not really Eurasian, it's Russian, it's not economic, it's political, and it's not really a union. And there are so many issues which are so vague. For example, if you look at the Armenia agreement, the commitments in services, they are so far-reaching, and actually, I don't know actually to what extent or how does it come that this is still compatible with the Eurasian Economic Union. But there are several experts here in the audience, and I'm sure that they will comment on this. So actually, maybe we can already now collect a first round of questions from the audience, and if we, or the speakers in any case, already want to respond to what has been said within this panel, we can do this after collecting a first round of questions. So yes, please briefly state your name, and of course we welcome very much comments and opinions, but keep these short and snappy, please.
We've discussed Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus quite broadly, but so we know that these countries, such as Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, achieved the main tangible result, which is visa liberalization. But what comes next? Because the society, taking into account that the media propaganda in these states are quite strong nowadays, and society needs to remain quite European, pro-European. So what could you say? What could be next tangible result which could maintain these kind of attitudes towards the European Union? Because as we saw last year in Georgia,
in the area of trade or more general?
In general, what could be the tangible results we could deliver to these countries? Because we saw last year radicalization in Tbilisi streets, so this is quite trendy nowadays, especially in my country. So what are your thoughts about it? I would like to hear. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Somebody else who wants to come in? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Stanislav. I'm a student here at the College of Europe. My question, I think, would be addressed to Professor Kataryna and Excellency Mingarelli. The question is, in your opinion, does DCFTA provides enough benefits to a partner country, consider its cost, and not even mentioning Russian punishment actions in case of Ukraine? Furthermore, DCFTA does not cover all areas of for free trade, for example, agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. So, in other words, does DCFTA is the right tool for transforming a country? Thank you.
Okay, maybe one last question before we go back to the panel. Yes, please. I'll try to go from left to right. The gentleman in the front.
Georg Bagdasaryan from Armenia, student at College of Europe. When we talk about trade, finally it's about agreements between states, unions, and etc. But at the same time, finally it's a business affairs also. I want to ask how European Union acts and works with in the field with business representatives, because there is a true lack of expertise and experience of working with these markets at the same time. And talking about Armenia, I can just have a short comment about CEPA agreement. Sure, we are a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, but at the same time, it was mentioned also by our ambassador that relations between Armenia and EU are relations based on values. So we don't see any limitations to develop our legislation with European standards, which is described in CEPA agreement. So in Armenia, we have a unique, especially now, we have that political will and also the order of Armenian society to realize all these reforms in our legislation. Thank you.
Many thanks. Maybe I think a panel can handle one more question before we go back to the panel. So now I go back to the left. And the gentleman in the back, please. Yes, you.
My name is Michał Gulczyński. I'm College of Europe alumnus, and I have a question about free trade agreements. As we know, we have DCFTAs with 3 countries, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and they all have FTAs with each other. So why wouldn't we have something like we had in the Central Europe, a CEFTA, Central European Free Trade Agreement, was a regional trade agreement, or even an EFTA, a regional or agreement with countries and including European Union, and creating a big free trade area. It would be beneficial for 2 reasons, I think. First, it would prevent the hub and spokes situation, so that the European Union is a hub and it's connected bilaterally with partners, but the partners are not connected with each other. And second, it would make it much easier for the importers to use the preferences if the rules were common and the tariffs were common for all those partners. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. So we have 4 questions. How to have more, create more tangible results? Does the DCFTA create enough benefits? How does the EU engage with business or vice versa? I think this is maybe something for the ambassador. And then about regional economic integration among the DCFTA countries. And we can start. Who wants to start or kick off? Or Kataryna, please.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll just answer about the DCFTA, the benefits for Ukraine. And the ambassador mentioned 2 very important things. Tariff liberalization, trade liberalization, that's already a stimulus, but it's the behind basically the non-tariff barriers, which are so important. And when we look at the nature of those states, from Moldova to Ukraine, those are captured states. In terms of the economic playing field is not even for all economic actors. When you look at tax, revenues, customs, subsidized loans, basically corporate riding, those are the elements that some economic actors more equal than others. If legal harmonization happens and it is actually implemented, we would have that level playing field. And we're talking about basically eliminating those extra privileges that some of the actors, insiders, have in order to extract rents. And from that point of view, the DCFTA is actually quite interesting because there were fears that the oligarchs would benefit most from trade liberalization. And what we've seen, the 2 oligarchic sectors in Ukraine, which is minerals and metals, have actually the importance within the DCFTA have decreased. What we've seen is spectacular growth of agricultural products being a major trade item. And that sector, despite having some oligarchic presence, is actually most diversified, and SMEs are very much represented there. For honey producer, for example, Ukraine exceeds quotas because there are many sort of medium players. Obviously, that tariff-free quotas are not big enough, but the agricultural sector is a success story when it comes to actually diversifying and thinking beyond the oligarchic business. But that the point of basically, as we call it, either state capture or corruption, there are 2 basic aspects to it. One is downstream, like there have been a lot of discussion about anti-corruption bodies in Ukraine, NABU, for example. Whereas my colleagues at Chatham House, I'm associate fellow at Chatham House, they produced a paper which basically the focus on Ukraine's anti-corruption reforms. Are they working? And what they argue for, so far, their emphasis has been on basically downstream tackling corruption. When corruption has taken place, punishing it, which is very difficult to do. What they say actually is the cleaning of the sectors from customs to VAT revenues to basically subsidies. Those are, if those sectors, the functional, basically, integration, which allows to change how the institutions, the state and the economic actors function. And that's really the value added of the DCFTA. Needless to say, it's very tricky. Perhaps I'll just say on the bilateral ties, I would agree that the multilateral sort of regional integration, it's something to aim for, it's desirable. But I'm a bit of realist or informed optimist. The bilateral ties for the time being are already demanding enough. And when we look at the trade, basically export structure of Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia, I'm not sure that actually the investment in making that, we are talking with the issue, the magic word of capacity. Asking the administration, state administrations, public administrations to work on those regional ties, they are desirable. I'm not sure in the short term cost-benefit analysis is such to justify it. So I would prioritize and sequence, focus on bilateral ties and actually domestic legal harmonization, and then that opening would happen. So I would not spend too much time, because what we already see is the actually overstretch and overloading of, because the agenda is so rich already. And in Moldova, I just cannot see that capacity to justify that particular focus right now. And I would just briefly, perhaps I do apologize for monopolizing. I've been unfortunate enough to work on both the association agreements and the Eurasian Economic Union. And there is, what we do in the EU, we extrapolate from the known, i.e. the EU, to the new and unknown, the Eurasian Economic Union. And we do presume this functional equivalence, which basically, the Eurasian Union is quite a complex beast, but it's definitely, as of today, it's not equivalent of the EU. So I would not, Guillaume has already mentioned that word. The Eurasian Economic Union, in the end, implements what works for Russia. For Russia, the trade with their Eurasian partners like Armenia and Belarus accounts for 5% of Russian trade. It's not important to make a difference for Russia, to make it basically want to have the Eurasian market. So what we have, it's a very complex sort of forward-looking declarations exceeding realities on the ground, but also the lukewarm commitment of the member states, including Armenia. And we know that the nature of accession ultimately determines the commitment. And we've seen all the member states of the Eurasian Economic Union is to minimize commitments and maximize flexibility. That's the nature. So presuming that we can sort out things in the region just by this sort of the union of unions or some kind of cross-union integration, I'm afraid it's a bit of wishful thinking rather than reality on the ground. So I'm afraid life is not simple anywhere, but the Eurasian integration is an example of exceeding complexity and the need to differentiate between a beautiful narrative and very messy realities on the ground.
Thank you. Who else wants to step in? Okay.
Your question on do this country really benefit from this DCFTA? In the short run, it's difficult to say that it will change the life of the citizens of these countries, because you need to wait for a few years. You cannot take over thousands of pieces of legislation to take over the acquis communautaire in 12 months. It takes some years. Bon. But there is no doubt that when a country manages to integrate the EU single market, it is extremely important for the living standard of the population of this country. This is obvious. And this is a maximum the EU can offer today. So it requires a bit of patience. It requires a bit of communication as well to explain all this. But believe me, the EU cannot offer anything more serious. Again, for the living condition of the population of these countries. What is the next step? The next step is the implementation. it would not be serious to. They started the implementation of this agreement 1 or 2 years ago. They have not yet implemented half of their commitments, and we should already set new objectives. Not serious. Let's focus on the implementation of these agreements, and once the bulk of the commitments have been fulfilled, it will be time to reflect on new objectives. Do we work with the business communities? Yes, on a daily basis. First of all, we associate the business community with the implementation and the monitoring of the implementation of this agreement in Ukraine constantly, the civil society in general and the business community in particular. And second point, it's clear that if we want really to ensure that the implementation of this DCFTA will bring all the benefits which are expected, we have to conduct other reforms, deregulation, rule of law, fight against corruption, better access to vocational training, facilitated access to credit, especially for SMEs. So there are a lot of parallel actions which have to be carried out, and for that we have to cooperate on a daily basis with the business community.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Natia?
I also want to add some tangible benefits of DCFTA. Does not matter company intends export or not. It has to implement standard, which means to produce EU quality product, and it means to protect consumers' rights, to ensure competition, to protect intellectual property rights, transparency, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, etc., etc. So those are main tangible assets what DCFTA can bring, and what citizens around the country or in the context of regional integration can be provided to the implementer country. I want also to put emphasis on the second issue about regional cooperation and another FTAs and Georgia-China's free trade agreement you mentioned. We do implement those different FTAs as well, and from 2018 January entered into force Georgia-China's agreement, which needs 5 years to be fully entered into force, and there are quite high expectation to attract foreign direct investment from China in Georgia and to have joint ventures in Georgia and to export Georgian origin product to the EU single market. That is also benefit that DCFTA can give Georgia. So those are two main highlights I wanted to share.
Yes. Hello. Yeah. So I would actually like to follow up to what Mr. Ambassador said, and in case of Moldova especially. Like a month ago, I was in Chisinau speaking with experts, and I was actually asking them the same question, like what the EU should do next. And I was really to hear that their answer was really, well, they were not expecting anything really new. What they were expecting was what Mr. Ambassador said, implementation of the association agreement. Because this is something what, however it sounds, it can really change the perception of the European Union in Moldova. If you would have depoliticized judiciary, if you will have improving economy, if we will have free media and so on and so forth, so all issues which are in the one way or the other tackled in the association agreement, and if the society in Moldova would see that basically this is somehow related with the fact that Moldova is integrating with the European Union, this would influence the perception of the EU. Of course, this can be also connected with permanent counter propaganda. I mean, I'm speaking about fake news. I'm speaking about Russian media, about what Russian media is actually, the image of EU which is created by the Russian media, and maybe stronger support for the NGOs in Moldova, which can work as those bottom-up organizations working in the field, building the positive image of EU, building the positive image of EU funds. So this is basically something what surely can be done. Maybe we can also think about issues like, I don't know, something in like the coordination and verification mechanism which works in Bulgaria and Romania, in case of Moldova, to watch closely, more closely the situation in the justice sector there. But those are the issues which are somehow expected by the locals. I really never heard about anything spectacular to be that the people there would be waiting for. And just a short remark here, and that the DCFTA in the end of the day is about business and about supporting business, and I fully agree here. And I would just like to add to the sweet peel I served you during the presentation that unfortunately, the fact that the figures are rising, that the trade is increasing, doesn't really mean that the business climate is changing. I mean, that it's improving, because of the fact that in many cases, in captured state like Moldova, money goes to not the people who would be proper to get those money, but to the proper companies. So this is the problem here. Yeah.
Okay, many thanks, Kamil. And as the futurist to the youth, Wisam, I don't know if you want to wrap this up or have some concluding remarks on what has been said. I mean, this is a challenging task, but nevertheless, please shoot.
Well, I didn't receive any questions regarding CEPA. I was kind of expecting some Armenians to shoot the roof. But before I had to stop due to time constraints, sadly, I wanted to just mention that some key issues when it comes to connectivity and when it comes to the European Union. The CEPA was also mainly about also creating connectivity, and when you go through the 359 pages of the CEPA declaration, it only mentions, let's say, the Nagorno-Karabakh issue only one time, for example, which kind of makes us question the fact that how can we, the European Union, deliver on the connectivity part when there is regional disputes in the area, for example. This is one of the issues. But it's not really that relevant, because what I kind of wanted to focus more on is that internally I believe that in order to make CEPA more comprehensive, much more achievable, I think that the Armenian National Platform should be involved in the CEPA. The civil society is of increased relevance when it comes to our contemporary time and when it comes to good governance. So definitely the Armenian National Platform should be highly involved in this, and thus it needs to instrumentalize CEPA in a way that the monitoring process resembles that of the association agenda that we can find in Moldova and that we can find in Georgia. I believe that this would not only achieve more tangible and more defined results through progressive implementation and of practical measure, but it will also establish a list of agreed priorities and thus systematic and well-structured approach. So the systematic approach and the priorities will be decoupled. It will be agreed upon and it will be systematically done one by one, and a civil society will thus be involved in it, which of course, not to mention, will increase transparency and it will increase input from the public as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks, but I think we can collect two more questions, or not? Okay, perfect. So, because I saw there were still some questions from the audience, so please, Professor Schumacher.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all panelists for this extremely fascinating conversation. Each and every time we discuss DCFTAs and economic cooperation and potentially integration, I cannot help but think that, again, as Wisam was also saying, this is quite a daunting task for a country, any country, in fact, that is not really being given a membership perspective and does not really, in fact, is not in a situation where, in fact, it can actually decide over the actual acquis that it is supposed to internalize. And my first question, I have two, very brief ones. My very first question touches precisely upon this very point. If I'm not mistaken, the European Union each and every year adopts 2,000 to 2,500 legal acts, the vast majority of which, of course, are related to the single market. Now, as each and every DCFTA partner country, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, is in a situation where it is basically busy approximating with adopting and implementing DCFTA-related stipulations, the acquis itself is further evolving. Yeah. So my question actually is, has this actually ever been taken into account? Are there any sort of measures that help the Moldovans, the Ukrainians, and the Georgians to cope, in fact, with an acquis that, is never really sort of static? To me, it feels as if, the partner countries are running behind the bus that has already left the bus stop. First point. Second point, could you possibly say a word or two on the idea that was launched at some point by the Ukrainians, mainly to eventually think of alternative options beyond eventually the association agreement? The key word here is customs union. Could you say a word about the feasibility and possibly also maybe relate that to the Georgian case? Because the Georgians have also started to, unfortunately I should say, pick up on that very, in my view, rather stupid idea.
Okay, one question and one question comment. And then there are some questions in the back. Elena, please.
Thank you very much. Kataryna, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on the Eurasian Economic Union, if I may, please. Well, yes, indeed, the reality is messy, and it is not a beautiful beast at the moment, but I don't think that the EU at the very beginning was a beautiful beast that everyone admired. So what I'm trying to say is, it is perhaps hollow when it comes to, certain structures and especially processes at the moment. But smaller states, like Belarus, for example, actually is currently working really hard in order to ensure that legislation-wise, the codex that will bring them together is well developed enough in order actually to ensure that the Eurasian Economic Union is not really just in the interests of Russia. So, and that's why I think the role of the EU could be really, really important in a sense to give and to share that knowledge with smaller states in order actually to invest in their capacity. We're not talking really about integration of integrations, not at all at this point of time, but actually helping them to become stronger internally in order then to challenge bigger players. I think it is absolutely logical and a rational thing to do. So what do you think about that? Thanks.
Okay, let's have a last question in this round. Somebody, yes, please, on the right.
Hello, and my name is Roman, a College of Europe student. So I have a question regarding the regarding Ukraine and the actions of Constitutional Court of Ukraine. Because it recently cancelled the provision on one of the provisions of criminal court and thus decriminalized corruption. And I wanted to know what influence will it have on the investment climate, on the economic cooperation between the EU and Ukraine, and what measures EU is planning to take upon these actions of the Constitutional Court. Thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions. One on the updating of the agreements and the stupid idea of a customs union, the Eurasian Economic Union comments, and then the developments on in Ukraine with regard to the Constitutional Court. I don't know who wants to go first.
One word. you are right, the acquis communautaire is evolving, and therefore we have to update the association agreement, and in particular the annexes. And we have started with Ukraine. We have started to update the annexes. The first sector we took is the energy sector, because we are currently negotiating with Russia and Ukraine a new transit gas contract, and it was necessary to make sure that the annexes of the association agreement was in line with the acquis communautaire. So you are absolutely right. These documents have to be living documents which have to be updated. Customs Union, as I said, first of all, let's put in place a DCFTA. And regarding the customs union, 2 points, 2 elements of reflection. One, we have a customs union with Turkey, and most people who are working on that say that it is not really a success, and it creates a lot of problems. Second point, we have always told everybody that we don't want to create any distance between Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia on one side and Russia on the other side, and that this country can perfectly have a DCFTA with the EU and at the same time strengthen their trade relation with Russia. But if they enter into a customs union with the EU, you can no longer say that. So I'm sure that if one day somebody put this proposal on the table, some member state will say, well, it is a political decision more than an economic one. Illicit enrichment, yes. Bon, the Constitutional Court made this absurd decision. It is a step back in the fight against corruption. Immediately, we have got on the table of the Verovna Rada 5 or 6 new draft bills to reintroduce this, and we told them immediately, let's set up a working group where our expert will explain what has to be taken into consideration to reintroduce this illicit enrichment provision in the right way in the relevant piece of legislation. It was an absurd maneuver, once again, well designed by some oligarchs to create the mess. And they reach their objectives.
Many thanks. If I can myself add one issue with regard to the shooting on the moving target with regard to approximation. And indeed, I mean, for example, in the case of Ukraine, some chapters were negotiated in 2009, 2010, almost 10 years ago. But actually, and parts of the association agreement were outdated before it entered provisionally into force. For example, with regard to public procurement, the old public procurement directives were incorporated in the agreement. But you see, actually, even without a formal decision of these joint bodies, Ukraine actually often takes into account already the new development, for example, with regard to public procurement, the new directives, without that actually there is a formal decision. But for legal certainty, I mean, it's best nevertheless to complete this process, and I mean, this will be a continuous thing. But now I'm happy to give again the floor to Kataryna. And sorry, in the meantime, I think this is the last time that everybody will hold a mic. So if you can reply to the questions, and if you have concluding remarks, please do it now.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I'll just start, it shows my sort of age, but I started working on Ukraine's relations with the EU by studying the critique of the PCA the Ukrainians made. It was my very first paper on the subject. And I have to say, when the negotiations on the association agreement started, it has to be said that every single complaint the Ukrainian side had about the PCA was answered and responded. The responsiveness of the EU has been really incredible and basically coming up with the association agreement. And one of the complaints was that it was not a living agreement. It could be updated as such. The idea of the annexes is very interesting because someone in Ukraine claims to have come up with the annexes so they could be updated separately without having to revise and ratify the whole agreement. I'm actually curious where this idea came from, but from that point of view, it is a living, dynamic, integrated integration-oriented agreement, as Guillaume says in his work. So this provides opportunities, but there is no doubt whatsoever. It is a very complex agreement, moving target, and of all the countries, probably Ukraine has most capacity to work out this sort of moving commitments, rolling commitments, but it's a big challenge because from one sector, one chapter to another, the nature of commitments, even the concept of legal approximation or harmonization, this requires a PhD level expertise. And it's basically, where is the army of lawyers specializing in EU law in Georgia and Moldova and Armenia, as it happens. So from that point of view, one area where I would like really to see the sort of association agreement plus interactions is when it comes to the actually updates of the agreements and the interpretation of the commitments. Because I really sympathize with officials from DG Trade when they have to explain the same things 3 times because there's no collective forum for those kind of discussions. Having said that, already things started in September of last year when the 3 countries actually came together. So that's sort of the first point on the living sort of nature of the agreement. And now the Eurasian Union. And as we know from the EU doesn't have basically any regional integration relies on domestic governance of the member states. So the implementation of commitments, integration commitments, relies on domestic capacity as such, i.e. the EU Commission has no separate structures, it relies on national administration. And from that point of view, that's the sort of transformative power promise of the EU. Having said that, I'm not sure if we've seen within the Eurasian Economic Union this same emphasis on good governance and improvement. Has anybody seen basically public finance management reforms promoted by the Eurasian Economic Union? What about public administration, decentralization, food safety standards agencies? Without that, I'm not sure if all beautiful sort of directives adopted in Moscow, whether actually they are going to make a big difference. And there's no doubt whatsoever, did a bit of work on Armenia. For Armenia, in 2013 and now, the EU is the modernizing partner and not the Eurasian Economic Union. And those are basically my observations so far.
Okay, many thanks for ending in any case on a positive note. I'm afraid that actually we have to, unless there are urgent concluding remarks that other panelists want to make, then I want to thank very much all speakers and all panelists here and also you for your very interesting questions and comments. And now I think we can, if there are still questions, no, there's no coffee. No coffee. There's already the next panel, sorry. So keep the questions in mind because I hope you still have some energy for the panel on energy security in the Eastern Partnership. So thank you very much.